In the beginning of the week, I merely mentioned it, but Scotland wanted to reduce its emissions by 75% by 2030. Now the government has admitted that this goal cannot be achieved. However, Edinburgh wants to stick to another ambitious climate project. So Scotland is abandoning its ambitious climate target, and the goal of reducing emissions by 75% by 2030 is unachievable, as Net Zero Minister Mary McAllen admitted on Thursday. The politician from the ruling Scottish National Party, the SNP, which is striving for independence from Great Britain, blamed the British central government primarily for this. However, Scotland wants to stick to its commitment to achieve net zero by 2045. The government's independent advisory body, the Climate Change Committee, the CCC, had previously criticised in a report that the Scottish regional government's plan was beyond what is credible. To achieve the target, emissions reductions in most industry would have to be increased ninefold by the end of the decade. And McAllen now announced, "We must now chart a course to 2045 at a pace and scale that is feasible, fair and equitable." The left-liberal Scottish regional government, which works with the Greens, was the first in the world to declare a climate emergency. The economy in this part of Britain has long been dependent on oil and gas projects in the North Sea. Recently, the leadership in Edinburgh has increasingly focused on renewable energies and wants to promote projects such as green hydrogen. The Conservative British central government in London, on the other hand, is committed to expanding oil and gas production and has watered down its climate promises despite criticism from its own ranks. The regional government of Scotland wanted to reduce emissions of its so-called greenhouse gases, as I said, by 75% by 2030. But now Scotland is the next country to have to bury its climate targets. The Scottish First Minister Humza Yousaf from the Scottish National Party is at the forefront of the Environmental League, and this of course also includes a policy of drastic decarbonisation until that point. And the aim to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, mainly CO2, and achieve net zero, that means climate neutrality by 2045, is still going further than Great Britain is doing as a whole. The climate ambition began with Yousaf's predecessor Nicola Sturgeon, who was the first government in the world, as I said, to declare a climate emergency and set the ambitious goal of net zero by 2030 for Scotland. Experts warned that despite great efforts, this would be difficult to achieve. And the Greens in the Scottish Parliament found the targets even not ambitious enough and even called for an 80% reduction. After successive milestones have been missed in recent years, Yousaf indeed has now had to admit that this cannot be achieved by 2030 and that this goal has now been officially abandoned. It is to be expected that the unattainable annual targets will also fall. But the final goal of 2045 remains the same for now. Perhaps a miracle could happen by then. But in any case, Yousaf might not be in government and have not been to explain that. But environmental groups reacted angrily, calling it the worst decision by the Scottish Parliament in its entire existence. The organization Net Zero Watch, which is critical of government restrictions on decarbonisation, was quite pleased about it though. Its director Andrew Montfort said, "The SNP and co-government Greens are the first government to acknowledge the reality of this matter, but they will not be the last. The era of self-important climate goals is coming to an end. Humza Yousaf is now proving to be a real climate leader." It was quite sarcastic, I must say. Net zero, the ambitious goal of achieving a balance between greenhouse gas emissions and removal, has ignited debate for several reasons. And that's why I want to go a little bit into the key points of contentions here. A major concern lies with a heavy reliance on unproven technologies like carbon capture and storage to achieve net zero. And critics argue that CCS is still in its infancy, which with limited large-scale deployment and potentially high costs. And this dependence, they say, creates a false sense of security, delaying the urgent need for immediate and significant emissions reductions across all sectors. And they advocate for prioritizing proven methods of emissions reductions like renewable energy and energy efficiency, while allowing more time for CCS to mature. Offsetting involves investing in projects that can remove carbon from the atmosphere elsewhere, like planting trees. However, critics raise questions about the effectiveness and legitimacy of offsets, and some worry about the impermanence of these solutions. Planted trees can burn in wildfires, for example, releasing the stored carbon back into the atmosphere. And others argue that offsets can be a form of greenwashing if they don't represent real measurable reductions elsewhere. Additionally, large-scale tree planting for offsets could compete with land needed for food production, creating unintended consequences. To address these concerns, calls are growing for stricter standards and regulations for offset projects to ensure they deliver genuine and lasting environmental benefits. The concept of net in net zero can be a sticking point as well. Critics argue that it can be a loophole allowing countries to continue emitting heavily as long as they invest in offsets elsewhere. And they call for more stringent regulations and detailed plans outlining how actual zero emissions will be achieved, not just balanced emissions. And this includes setting ambitious near-term emissions reduction targets and outlining clear steps to achieve them. Transparency is also crucial. Countries need to be clear about their emissions reduction strategies and the role, for example, offsets will play. The road to net zero raises questions of fairness as well, and some argue that the burden of achieving it falls too heavily on developing countries that have contributed less to greenhouse gas emissions compared to developed nations. And they believe wealthier nations should take on a larger share of the emissions reductions and provide financial and technological support to developing countries transitioning to cleaner energy sources. Developed nations should also acknowledge their historical responsibility for climate change and contribute more resources to help developing countries adapt to the impacts they are already experiencing. Transitioning to a net zero economy will necessitate significant changes across industries, potentially leading to job losses in some sectors that rely heavily on fossil fuels. A just transition requires comprehensive plans to address these potential disruptions. And this includes retraining programs for workers whose jobs are affected, as well as investments in new industries and green technologies that will create new employment opportunities. And additionally, there are concerns that the costs of achieving net zero could be significant, potentially impacting economic growth. However, proponents argue that the long-term economic benefits of a stable climate and reduced reliance on fossil fuels outweigh the short-term costs of transition. A significant reduction in emissions will likely necessitate changes in individual consumption habits as well. This could include transitioning to electric vehicles, using public transportation more often, reducing energy consumption in homes and businesses, and adopting more sustainable food choices. While some welcome these changes as a necessary step towards a healthier planet, others are apprehensive about potential limitations on their lifestyles. Effective communication strategies are crucial to address these concerns and ensure public buy-in for the necessary changes. And despite these controversies, net zero remains the central goal for combating climate change, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the leading international body for climate science. The IPCC emphasizes the urgency of achieving net zero to limit global warming and mitigate the worst effects of climate change. Addressing the concerns I outlined in this video is crucial for ensuring a just and effective transition to a net zero future, but it is a far more complex and far more difficult thing to do without destroying the economies of the countries than some people are always putting it in place. And I'm especially talking about our disruptors here that still think crimes are a legitimate way of demonstrating. Nevertheless, if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.